Dwight D. Eisenhower became the 34th President of America in January 1953. He had been the top commander of the Allied forces which defeated Hitler and later served as Supreme Commander of NATO for a couple of years prior to the presidency. He had won the presidency in November 1952 with running mate Richard Nixon. Eisenhower's main achievements in foreign affairs were as follows. He actually brought the Korean War to an end within a few months. He also managed the early stages of the Cold War without triggering a nuclear response. Number 3, he avoided war in Vietnam. Number 4, in regard to the Suez Canal crisis, he supported Egypt and forced Britain and France to withdraw from the conflict. And lastly, he also approved CIA plans to topple governments in both Iran and Guatemala. We'll look at these things in more detail later. On the domestic front, he was also quite a successful president. He developed a strong, cost-effective defence system. He pushed through the Highway Interstate Act, partly with a view to nuclear response and in order to clear cities quickly. He encouraged the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 1957, and he also actually used federal troops, the first president to do so, to enforce civil rights in the educational area. He also developed the social system to include an additional 10 million Americans. He considered himself a compassionate conservative. Overall, Eisenhower is considered one of the most influential leaders of the 20th century. Following his election, Eisenhower went to Korea in December 1952. He overflew the area and realized it would take another 300,000 troops to win the war. Both sides had reached a stalemate, with battles raging still around the 38th parallel in the center of Korea. North Korea was supported by China and the Soviets, and the South was supported by the US. Eisenhower had made a campaign promise to end the war and bring the soldiers home. He threatened China through various channels with the use of atomic weapons if they increased their support for North Korea. Stalin died on the 5th of March 1953, and this may well have contributed to the eventual Korean armistice, which was agreed a few months later in July 1953. Both sides agreed to divide Korea roughly along the 38th parallel. The situation ended up where it started. About 5 million people lost their lives in this proxy war between the two superpowers. Over 36,000 US soldiers also died in the conflict. It was seen as a triumph for Eisenhower to have ended the conflict without a nuclear exchange, however. Henceforth, North Korea became a communist state supported by China, and South Korea became a private state supported by the United States. In the following years, relations between the US and China remained tense as Korea, Taiwan, and Indochina continued to dominate affairs. Mao Zedong won the Chinese Civil War in 1949 and declared China a communist state. The losing nationalist side retreated to the island of Taiwan. President Truman refused to recognize the mainland China and regarded Taiwan as the legitimate head of the nation. Eisenhower continued this policy, and Congress passed the Formosa Resolution, which granted the president authority to take whatever military action he deemed necessary to defend the independence of Taiwan. Also in Southeast Asia, there was the question of Indochina, which had been a French colony since up to the Second World War, and consists basically of 3 countries, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. However, during the war, the French lost control of Indochina as Japan invaded Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh emerged as a strong resistance leader during this period. After the war, the French attempted to reassert their claims on the colony, but were defeated by Ho Chi Minh in the battle in 1954. The French had become dependent on US financial support as well, in order to maintain the colony. At the Geneva talks in 1954, France agreed to give up their claims on the colony. The Geneva Accords also agreed to split Vietnam along the 17th parallel. Henceforth, the North would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh as a communist leader, while the South was under French puppet Bao Dai. It was also agreed to hold elections in 1956 to decide the future of Vietnam. However, in 1955, Ngo Dinh Diem pushed the emperor aside and became president of South Vietnam. He also refused to hold elections as agreed at Geneva. Diem was a Catholic and was supported by the French and by the US, but he never achieved acceptance as a ruler in the South. His brutal methods against the Buddhist community in particular to assert control was unacceptable to most Americans. The US gradually lost faith in Diem, and he was eventually assassinated in October 1963, a month before John F. Kennedy was killed. Eisenhower, as an experienced army general, seems to have recognized early on the nightmare that Vietnam could become. In the early 1950s, he helped the French with money and bombers. He also set up the Southeast Treaty Organization, which was a group of 8 countries created to fight communism in Asia. However, the C2 organization never really became a united military force, and it was left to the Americans to decide whether to support South Vietnam or allow it to become communist. By 1959, Ho Chi Minh began to support communist groups in the South through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So by the late 1950s, Vietnam had become 2 nations. Eisenhower sent a few hundred military personnel as advisors, but was reluctant to get further involved without congressional support and the participation of the United Nations. In regard to Europe, Eisenhower was frustrated by France's refusal to go along with his proposal to develop a European Defence Union. France feared that this idea could lead to a remilitarization of West Germany. Memories were still too fresh in regard to what happened a decade earlier. But by the mid-1950s, the US came to regard the Soviet Union and China as a far bigger threat than Germany. By May 1955, Eisenhower pushed for the entry of West Germany into NATO as a full member. Hungary was also a troubled nation. In 1956, Hungarian nationalists launched a rebellion against Soviet rule. They hoped to get US backing, but were soon crushed by brutal Soviet tactics, which killed several thousand people. The rebels had basically misjudged the situation. Eisenhower was not prepared to risk a nuclear exchange over the status of a satellite state in the Soviet Union. However, the Hungarian rebellion did give an early sign of the basic weakness at the heart of the Soviet system. Eisenhower had also insisted on Austria becoming an independent nation prior to the Geneva talks in 1954. The Soviets agreed to this on the basis that Austria remained strictly neutral. The Middle East also became a contentious area during the 1950s. The Egyptian Prime Minister Abdel Nasser aimed to pursue an independent course for his country. He was happy to accept American financial help to build the Aswan Dam, but he also bought weapons from Czechoslovakia and recognized Mao's communist China. Eisenhower withdrew his financial support from Nasser, and he responded by nationalizing the Suez Canal. This in turn angered Britain, France and Israel, who attacked Egypt. However, Eisenhower feared such attacks would lead to a united Arab front against Western powers and basically force Britain and France to withdraw from the conflict. In regard to Iran and Guatemala, Eisenhower approved CIA plans to topple governments in both countries. In regard to Iran, the parliament there had nationalised Anglo-Iranian oil, thereby breaking a €75 lease agreement. Churchill persuaded Eisenhower to help in regard to this matter, and they both worked together to topple the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Afterwards, the oil deal was re-established and the US oil companies became equal shareholders with the British. However, the issue re-emerged during the Carter administration in the late 70s. Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Teddy, was the main man at the head of the operation known as Operation Ajax. Historians also believe that Eisenhower was strongly influenced by the Dulles brothers in regard to these decisions. John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State, and his brother was the head of the CIA. Another CIA operation took place in Guatemala in 1954. Here, the Prime Minister, Jacobo Arbenz, a socialist, was disposed in favour of military dictator Castelo Armas. Arbenz had planned to create minimum wages and distribute millions of acres of land to poor peasants. The United Fruit Company already owned hundreds of thousands of acres and were unhappy with the compensation package offered. Almost 40 years of rebellion followed as left-wing guerrillas sought to overthrow the US-backed right-wing dictators. Eisenhower also approved the Bay of Pigs operation, which attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. This was another CIA-backed operation planned from bases in Guatemala and Florida. In regard to the Soviet Union, throughout the 1950s, US relations with the Soviet Union were often tense in the early stages of what became known as the Cold War. The Soviet Union developed the atomic bomb in 1950, and 5 years later they developed the hydrogen bomb, a much more dangerous bomb. However, Eisenhower had proposed an open skies policy at the Geneva talks in 1954, whereby both powers could overfly each other's territories, but this was rejected by Khrushchev as he knew it would expose Soviet weaknesses. In 1956, Eisenhower approved CIA plans to overfly Soviet territory anyway, without permission. 3 years later, in October 1959, the Soviet leader Khrushchev visited the United States, and this somewhat eased tensions between the two superpowers. Plans were laid for arms limitation talks between these powers in May 1960. However, these talks were scuppered when basically the Soviets shot down a United States U-2 spy plane sometime before the talks. Khrushchev used the occasion to demand an apology, and he then stormed out of the meeting in protest. There was actually also tension in regard to technology. The Soviets launched Sputnik into orbit in October 1957, and this development shocked many Americans. It meant a Soviet satellite going over America several times a day. It also showed that the Soviets had actually developed technology capable of firing intercontinental ballistic missiles. Eisenhower responded to this situation by approving NASA the following year, which put a man on the moon within a decade. Eisenhower is often praised by historians for the balance and good judgment he brought to bear in relation between the United States and China and the Soviet Union. However, he is equally criticised for the harsh treatment he dished out to smaller nations such as Iran and Guatemala by writers like Noam Chomsky. Such writers believe that the massive sums invested in defence by the US could have been put to better use in regard to health, education and social services, and would have been a more effective way to fight communism. In relation to domestic policy, the 1950s was a time of great opportunity and prosperity. By 1955, the population had reached over 160 million. The average US citizen was earning $65 a week, far higher wages than most other countries. The United States was by far the most prosperous and powerful nation in the world. There were over 50 million cars on American roads. Eisenhower approved the interstate highway system in the mid-50s to cope with the new massive demand for travel. People on average had more radios, better TVs, more washing machines and other luxuries than anywhere else in the world. Millions of people were coming to America to experience a better way of life. However, there was also a negative side in the form of McCarthyism. This involved making false claims against government employees, accusing them of corruption, communism, and even treason. Senator Joseph McCarthy made several such claims. He developed a huge name for himself in this regard. He eventually attacked the military, where his claims were exposed as lies. From the mid-50s onwards, he became a decline in force. However, McCarthyism did do a lot of damage, and it got rid of a lot of top experts from the State Department. They understood that Vietnam and China had centuries-old disputes between them. Communism was never likely to unite them or create the feared domino effect in Asia so often talked about at that time. McCarthy eventually died of alcoholism in 1959. In 1957, Eisenhower pushed through the Civil Rights Act. He also sent troops into Little Rock College in Arkansas to enforce the rights of coloured students. He was a progressive conservative and expanded Social Security to include an additional 10 million Americans. Eisenhower also developed the nuclear program in a very cost-effective way to ensure American defence. By 1960, the national debt was $383 billion, about 75% of total production. Eisenhower was greatly admired as the supreme commander who defeated Hitler in the Second World War. He was also a very effective president who stood firm against the expansionist plans of the Soviet Union and China. However, he also set damaging precedent, toppling democratic governments in both Iran and Guatemala. His plans to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba also ended in disaster. In regard to his personal life, Dwight D. Eisenhower was born in Denison, Texas in 1890. He was the third of 7 children. He came from a poor family, and Dwight often worked hard as a young teenager to support the family income. He attended West Point Military Academy as a young man and spent most of his life in the army. In 1916, he married Mary Dow, and they had 2 sons. Millions regard him as one of the great American presidents for managing the early stages of the Cold War and avoiding nuclear exchange with both China and the Soviet Union. In his final farewell address on TV to the American people in January 1961, he warned about the dangers of what he called the industrial military complex. Giant US corporations had a vested interest in massive investments in defence. In a private conversation, he once said, "God bless anyone in this position who knows less about the military than I do." He died on the 28th of March 1969 at the age of 78.